Hello and welcome to Superpower Broadcasting. I'm Kevin Castley. Tonight we're going to be joined by Anthony Avistubison, Raymer Same, as well as Anthony Roberto. However, before we get into the panel, I have a few things to go over here and a video clip from NBC. So the first part of this is that we have new intelligence out, new reporting indicating from multiple sources, but I'm going off of the Associated Press here that the Trump administration was aware as far back as early 2019, last year, about the intel indicating that the Kremlin was putting bounties on American soldiers conducting operations in Afghanistan and paying the Taliban and their associates to murder U.S. soldiers. Now, we had done a stream which included these guests as well, just a couple of days ago, in which we were covering the intel as it had broken. We had news out that had indicated that Trump knew about this several months ago. However, now we find out that it was an additional year before then. So John Bolton talks about how he briefed Donald Trump as far back as March 2019 about the intel indicating that Russia was paying the Taliban to kill U.S. troops. Additionally, we have reporting indicating that it was placed in a presidential daily briefing as well about early of 2019. And so Trump was aware of it. And so the problem here is that a presidential daily briefing isn't just hearsay or rumors or anything. It's the top level of intel that is available. It goes and is directly presented to the president. So all of the doubts, all of the possibly bunk intel, etc., would be filtered out by that point. In other words, it's the most credible intel of the day that's presented to the president. Donald Trump was aware of it. Now, additionally here, we see that there were a couple of groups involved. There was the basically the Taliban in particular, but also those associated with them. There were a couple of other groups that were basically set up to receive money in exchange for killing U.S. troops. And so there is, however, we have to be fair here. We have to offer the other side. Donald Trump says that, and he's claiming right now that he wasn't briefed on it. He wasn't basically told about this information, and he has a corroborating source right now. And that corroborating source, as we're going to see in the clip that I'm going to play for you, happens to be Vladimir Putin's press secretary. That's Dmitry Peskov. So if anybody would know if it were true or not, it would be the Russians, right? And they say they didn't do it. So, I mean, there you go. So there's Donald Trump and then the Russians. They say they didn't do it. And then there's the U.S. intelligence community and John Bolton, etc., who say that, the Russians were doing this and Donald Trump was briefed on it. So we're going to take a look at a clip from NBC here. It's just a couple minutes, and they go over this a little bit more.
Tonight, growing outrage over reports Russia offered cash for killing American soldiers in Afghanistan. Officials familiar with the intelligence tell NBC News that the US gathered information showing that Russian operatives offered bounties to the Taliban. One official saying American service members and Afghan civilians died as a result. Though other officials tell us the intelligence was uncorroborated. Overnight, President Trump tweeting, "Intel just reported to me that they did not find this info credible and therefore didn't report it to me." Now, President Putin's spokesman pushing back in an exclusive interview with NBC News.
Maybe I can sound a little bit rude, but this is a 100% bullshit.
But tonight, bipartisan calls in Congress for an investigation. Republican Liz Cheney tweeting, "Who did know and when? What has been done to protect our forces and hold Putin accountable?" President Putin's spokesman telling NBC News, Russia has received no complaint from American officials.
Has anyone raised this with you, complained to the Russian government about this, or said that there will be implications?
As far as I'm concerned, none of American representatives has ever raised this question against Russian representatives.
Tonight, the White House briefed top Republicans who say there's now an ongoing review to determine the accuracy of the intelligence.
Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews.
Yeah, so we'll just remove the avatar right here so we can get into the panel tonight. So there you see the press secretary for Vladimir Putin right there. He called it 100% bullshit. So that's the other side. That's the other side. The Kremlin says they didn't do it. Of course, as I was saying, it wasn't just the Taliban that they were working with. There was the Haqqani group as well that they were essentially offering bounty to. So it was widespread across Afghanistan. And Donald Trump, I mean, instead of commenting on how horrible this is, on how this is a travesty, and how he wishes he would have been aware of this or whatnot, he's just simply say, nobody told me about it. Nobody told me about it. I didn't know about it. Nothing, no condemnation towards Putin or anything. You would think, like, if he were genuinely telling the truth, he'd say, hey, look, I wasn't briefed, but that's insane. This is unacceptable. But no, he can't say that because Daddy Vladdy wouldn't be happy. So with that, we're going to get into our panelists tonight. We have Anthony Avista-Bisson and Ray Murasame with us currently. We'll be joined shortly by Anthony Roberto, but we'll begin with Anthony Avista-Bisson for your thoughts on the new revelations here that Donald Trump had further 12 months or so awareness of the intelligence indicating that the Russians were placing bounties on American soldiers. So,
okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Anthony Avista-Bisson, freelance writer for the Jerusalem Post, and my area of focus is the Middle East and North African region. Now, my thoughts on this is that I'm not really that surprised. If you read in Bolton's book, he actually mentions times where he would brief the president on matters regarding Iraq, Syria, or Afghanistan, and the president, regardless of what the details of the briefing were, would always interrupt the briefing or go on tirades of unrelated matters, always going towards the talking point of when we're going to get out of Afghanistan, or why isn't Mattis using the best of his capabilities to defeat the Taliban. And of course, we're talking about that in 2018, but here in 2019, the fact that Trump was informed about this, as I said before, it doesn't surprise me. And to be totally honest, the fact that there has not been anything done about it really is not surprising either. I just think it's completely terrible that we have essentially US leadership that is not reacting to the fact that US soldiers are being targeted and potentially killed by a state entity. Any other administration, whether it be the Obama administration or the Bush Jr. administration, would have put some form of sanctions or done some form of action or reprimanded someone in the Russian government on this matter. But the fact that nothing has been done only highlights the lack of leadership that the United States, at least under the Trump administration, is displaying.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I just find this idea that you have the president of the United States, and we've got a man here who just today he tweeted out just a random phrase. He said, "the lone warrior," I guess in reference to himself. And I responded to him and I'm like, hey man, you're not alone. You command hundreds of thousands of troops, over 1 million troops, and you didn't care that their lives are in harm's way, that your rival is placing bounties on their head. Here you are calling yourself the lone warrior. He's the lone traitor at this point. I mean, he's the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Armed Forces, and he honestly doesn't care about their lives at all. This entire scenario in which we're living, it's just in many ways it's unbelievable, except all the credible intel that's out there indicates that this is the case of what's going on. People have said, especially the Trump sycophants, as well as the Jimmy Dore crowd, the Kyle Kulinski crowd, those types of people have said, well, how can you trust the intelligence agencies? They're fake news. Placing their frame of reference for what's truthful and what's believed to be credible on literally the Kremlin and Donald Trump. Like, it's not to say that the intelligence agency the intelligence agencies of the U.S. are always right. It's to say that they're more credible than the word of Donald Trump and Dmitry Peskov. But that makes you sound like a warmonger. So with that, we're going to get into Ray Murasame for your commentary here.
Yeah, it's good to be back again. We were talking about this just previously, except it's gotten worse since the last time we had a conversation. So I'll just give a quick intro. My name is Ray Murasame. I'm a cultural commentator and political analyst from the perspective of a third worldism tendency. So, I mean, the thing that immediately stood out to me when you played that clip from MSNBC just now was how they're denying that the intelligence was rooted in a certain level of certainty. That's what they came up with at first, that they want to kind of downplay it and say that they had never actually, seen this as credible, or there was some kind of like doubts as to whether it was credible or not. However, they then went on and undermined this, because I'm sure you all watched the press conference that Kayleigh McEnany had yesterday. Well, today, depending on which time zone you're in. Yesterday/today, within the last 8 to 10 hours, you know what I mean? Where she went in there and the press asked her a bunch of questions. And then in the course of that press conference, she acknowledged that the information about Vladimir Putin and GRU essentially placing bounties on the heads of NATO soldiers was actually in the presidential briefing, and that Trump may have read, well, not may have read it, did in fact read it, because she insisted that Trump read everything that happened and that he was fully aware of it. She didn't mention how long he was aware of it, but she did say that he was aware of it, right? So if the information made it into the daily briefing, that shows just how confident intelligence were in the certainty of this development, because it would not have made it into the daily briefing otherwise. And there are plenty of figures in the intelligence community who have said that the fact that it made it into the daily briefing itself is an incredible sign of how confident people were in this information. It would never have been there otherwise. The other thing which is key to note is that apparently Trump has known this for a year, not 3 months. He has known this since early 2019. It then later emerged.
Yeah, over a year. Yeah, that's the thing. That's the thing, is that with Donald Trump here, their claims essentially would indicate that, well, it's we didn't know. He didn't know. Nobody told him about it. Yet, as you rightfully point out, McEnany today said basically, he does read what's in the presidential daily briefings. Now, I know that we have one of the commenters who, he regularly follows this program, and he was commenting that Trump doesn't read the presidential daily briefings. And I am inclined to believe that most of the time, he doesn't really read that. That's why he demanded that they be reduced in age from 8, and that one page of text be replaced with basically charts, graphs, pictures, that kind of stuff, because he doesn't like to read. But with Trump, though, there was the question, well, does he read? Does he read it? And she said, yes, he does read. He does read it. So they're trying to have it both ways in that sense. They're trying to defend him on the grounds against him being accused of being stupid or incurious by saying, oh, no, he reads everything. But then on the other hand, trying to say, oh, but he didn't see that, or he didn't know that. It's like, which is it? Either he doesn't read, or he does
delivered to him. Also, Bolton says that he himself told Donald Trump about this issue orally. So I mean, it was literally spoken to him, just in case he hadn't actually read it, right? So he's been double told.
Oh, probably multiple times. That's the other thing.
Multiple times, because counting the number of instances in which these instances of him being placed on different dates, there must have been at least 4 different dates in 2019 that he was told this on. And they're all obviously within the early 2019. So, I mean, he has literally no excuse for this. Also, this
I'm going to
lone warrior
play.
thing, this lone warrior thing where he's on Twitter tweeting about lone warrior in the midst of like, why is he not answering questions? I mean, I want to just point out as well, Kayleigh McEnany was supposed to show up at, what was it, 3:30 p.m., 15:30 hours at Eastern time. She actually showed up 18 minutes late, wasted 5 minutes of the 15 minutes she had remaining, and then left early when journalists started to ask questions she didn't like. So that was barely even a press conference, just in case anyone was wondering whether that qualified as a press conference. Like, I don't think having like 9 minutes of conversation in which most of the time she spent essentially berating the press, attacking the New York Times, and then undermining her boss's own position by pointing out that he had indeed read it. So,
well, see, that's the thing. That's the thing, is because it's this knee-jerk response that you always want to make the leader look good. And so you'd want to make the leader look good by saying, oh, he didn't know, because the worst case is that he did and he didn't do anything about it. But then in this microcosm where a new question is asked, separate of all other context, separate of all other strategy, there's no calculation that, well, if we're going to commit to this lie, we basically have to commit to him being an idiot. Or there's none of that. It's just, oh, now they're asking, well, does he read? Oh, yeah, he does read. And
yeah, he does.
So
He reads everything, right?
Yeah, I downloaded a clip.
So they
I have a clip
immediately
here.
undermine themselves. But yeah, okay,
yeah, I
you
have
play
a
the
clip
clip.
here from the Lincoln Project. It's a very brief clip. I just got it right now as we were going, because I remembered I saw this earlier today, and I thought, yes, we don't need to watch a 9-minute press conference. You don't need to watch a 9-minute answer. All that you need to see is this 6-second clip right here that was compiled by the Lincoln Project. So here we go.
This is CNN breaking news.
The president does read.
Yeah, he reads. He reads. That was for the Lincoln
The
Project.
president does read. That is brilliant. That is a brilliant clip.
So that's like, a bunch of Republicans that are sick and tired of this Trump guy going out there and selling out U.S. interests left and right. Literally, by the way. I mean, this is a guy right now where if you oppose him in any way, if you go against the party line, if you say, oh, no, that he's not right about that, that immediately disqualifies you from the party and makes you a lifelong Democrat and a lifelong communist. That's what they did to Mitt Romney. That's what they're doing to John Bolton.
I mean, this lone warrior thing that I want to touch on as well, just before we go to Anthony Roberto as well. This lone warrior thing, a lot of people don't realize the first time that this lone warrior thing was used, the story becomes kind of scary once you actually think about this, because it's not just a random set of words or a random nickname he gave to himself and typed into Twitter to distract people, because he loves doing this nonsense where he'll just declare in the middle of the night something in all caps on Twitter. No. This time around, it actually has a backstory. So this thing, the lone warrior, the last time that phrase was used was apparently, or at least last time that we're aware of him using this phrase, was apparently in 2017 when he walked into a room that contained Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, and he jokingly referred to Xi Jinping as the lone warrior, and Vladimir Putin then looked at him in this weird way and began smiling and laughing. What a person can actually interpret from this joke is that actually the lone warrior is a nickname that Vladimir Putin gave to Donald Trump. And so it became funny in that moment when Donald Trump tried to slap this name onto Xi Jinping. That's what I think happened.
Oh, man.
And so for him to then write the lone warrior in all caps in like the middle of the night for no apparent reason, it just means that he is repeating back to Twitter the nickname which Vladimir Putin gave to him.
The lone warrior. Oh, that's so sad. That's so sad. I mean, because we all know what Donald Trump would actually be referred to in the inner circle in the Kremlin when he's not there.
The useful idiot.
Well, I mean, they call the Donald Trump supporters and whatnot the useful idiots. With Donald Trump, he actually owes big money to them. They probably have some choice words for him right there. That So, I mean, useful idiot is putting it nicely with this guy. I mean, he's basically Putin's fluffer at this point. It's pathetic. And I want to go to that clip one more time just to make it very clear in case there was doubt as to whether or not Donald Trump does read the presidential daily briefings, because it's not just, oh, does he read or whatnot? The context is about, does he read the intelligence? Well, this is his press secretary answering that question.
This is CNN breaking news.
The president does read.
Love that.
That's a classic. That's a classic right there. So we're gonna go to Anthony Roberto now. So how are you doing, Anthony?
Pretty good. Hi, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, cool. So I did some reading this morning, and apparently, in the past year and a half, there hasn't been any new sanctions that were put on Russia regarding anything to like Afghanistan or anything like that, though. So for those of you out there that say like, well, he might have done something or he might have done this or that, there's absolutely nothing. He's renewed some sanctions. He did some other stuff in other places, but there's no sanctions or freezing of assets or anything like that regarding like Afghanistan or any other things in Central Asia. So it looks like if Trump knew about this back in January of 2019, there's absolutely nothing that he's done. And I looked through all the sanctions. I read reports and I read all the stuff. He's absolutely done nothing, like zero. And that's kind of disturbing. Like not even like an extra slap on Wagner or anything like that. So it's just really disappointing.
No, I remember you were telling me off before we went on air earlier today. You were showing me like, a list of the sanctions that have been done, and in respect to certain geopolitical events that occurred. None of them were motivated by this. For example, the Magnitsky stuff. There was a lot of stuff over Ukraine in terms of their handling of using weapons of mass destruction on British territory. There were sanctions in response to that, but there was nothing. There was nothing there. Directly resulting from their behavior in Afghanistan. So just to answer that, there was just a note about name tags. We do have the name tags up right now, but whenever you do highlight a comment, it removes the name tags. So, but everybody can see who we are right here. So be sure to go and follow these three over on Twitter, for example. Anthony Evistu-Bisson is at Stoic Viper. Ray Murasame is at Ray Murasame. And then Anthony Roberto is at Global Affairs. So with that, we are going to go back to the panel. So
can I just quickly make a point that Russia's not the only state actor that has actually put bounties on US soldiers and had asked the Taliban to essentially kill US soldiers. We also have the Iranian regime back in the early 2010s, as well as even presently working with the Taliban against the United States. However, in this instance, because it meets well with Trump's rhetoric or anti-Iran rhetoric, of course, you would think that, okay, it goes in the grand scope of combating Iran because you have the sanctions on them. You have the limitations put on Iran. So you naturally think, okay, everything has been done to address Iran, including its helping of the Taliban in killing US soldiers. However, it goes back to the point that Anthony mentions, it goes back to the point that Ray mentions, goes back to the point that I have mentioned, basically, is that nothing has been done about Russia over the year, as Anthony mentioned. Not any sanctions, not even a condemnation, nothing whatsoever, which again goes to my original point in how much of a lack of leadership there is currently in the US administration, under the Trump administration.
Yeah, absolutely. Nothing's been done. And that's the point that I want people to really realize here, is that regardless of which side you're on, whether you tend to support the Democrats or the Republicans, there was a time when the idea of supporting the troops was it was a bipartisan thing. Now, there would be a disagreement over how you do that. However, right here, you have a blatant selling out of the safety of U.S. troops by Donald Trump. This is a guy right here, by the way, who talks about Oh, he wants to end the wars, and he has the rhetoric with his buddy Tucker Carlson about how, bring the boys home. We just care about the troops. Well, no, it turns out they don't actually care about troop safety at all. They had no response to this, nothing. And I'm sure that over the coming days, we'll probably get new information indicating that not only was this in the presidential daily briefing, not only did John Bolton tell Trump about it, but there will probably be other sources that come out that say, we kept pushing this, we kept reminding him about this, and he did nothing. Because if you're in the administration and you're aware of what's going on and you see that he's not doing anything, you would think, well, does he understand the intelligence? I should remind him about it. I'm sure he was told about this we're talking about a time frame now of upwards of 18 months, 15, 18 months. He was probably told about this many times, on many occasions. And now it's just coming to light. And they want to have it both ways. They want to say, oh, yeah, he's aware, he reads, as well as he didn't know anything. So.
And actually, I just wanted to say, too, keep in mind with all this going on, Trump wants to add Putin back onto the G7 with all this going on.
Yeah. So it's a reverse. Yeah. It's not just that they're adding additional sanctions to Russia. It's that they want to go and extend an olive branch. They want to give favor to the Kremlin, despite everything that has happened. So it begs the question, whose side is he on? So with that, we're going to go to Ray Murasame. So feel free to jump in if you got any additional thoughts here.
Yeah, well, in regards to whose side is he on, I don't even know if he himself knows, but this is one of those things where they're not considering, or maybe they have considered and they just don't care. But, Russia's end game in Afghanistan is something that needs to be considered. So from my understanding of the way that they've been behaving, in 2001, Russia was broadly supportive, quote unquote, supportive of the US intervention into that absolute disaster that was Afghanistan at the time, because of the fact that they viewed it as tamping down a terrorist threat that was emanating from Afghanistan. And they even helped the United States in securing basing rights in what countries were these? Kyrgyzstan and let's see if my memory actually holds up on this. It was 2 countries that they helped them on. The first one was Kyrgyzstan and the other one was something else.
Uzbekistan?
Possibly.
I think
I'll
that's
correct myself later if it comes to mind. But that happened. And so I think the US kind of then, lulled itself into an unfortunately false sense of security on Russia's behavior, not realizing that they will swing around and do something else quite different later on when the need hits them. And by need, I put need in quotation marks, obviously. After 2014, when they got essentially dealt with in Ukraine because of the bad behavior that was going on, that they were sponsoring Yanukovych and his cronies and so on to loot the country. No need to talk about that. Everyone knows how Ukraine went. I think after this point, I'd consider that to be kind of like a turning point of in terms of Russia's interactions with Afghanistan, even though they were already turning in 2013. It's just in 2014 that turn was completed. And this all stems from the belief in Moscow that the United States will withdraw from Afghanistan, and that it will do so in a way that does not leave the Taliban as being 100% defeated. So that's the calculus they were going with in the first place. But why do they care? People may be wondering. The reason they care is because Russia has basically a pure power. How do I describe this? I'm trying to describe it without literally using an insulting term, but Russia's approach is extremely short-sighted in the way that they're approaching this, because they're only thinking of their relative power versus every other power in the region, and they're not thinking about the second and third order effects of their activities. So for whatever reason, Russia believes that if they can act as a kingmaker in Afghanistan, in other words, if they can have various levels of terror actually continuing to exist in Afghanistan, and then they serve as kind of like a kingmaker that balances the different forces of terror, that this will actually place them in an advantageous position to determine what happens in the region. this is, of course, I mean, if you sit down and think about it for long enough, this is obviously nonsensical, because you shouldn't actually be playing with, different sets of terrorism in order to figure out what's going to happen, because we all know how this plays out, because Islamic fundamentalists are not normal rational forces that you can play balance with, because they have extremely strong feelings about secular powers and will eventually come back to bite you anyway. But nevertheless, they are pushing ahead with this and have been going about this this project for quite a while. So they have two objectives. The first, of course, is to make everything that the United States or NATO does there as difficult as possible. And the second is actually to utilize the threat of the terrorism which they themselves are fostering to exert more influence in the region by then counter-posturing themselves as being someone who is capable of preventing terror. So it's very, very cynical, because obviously Central Asian states are not going to like the nonsense that is spilling out of Afghanistan, and then Russia will come in and say, oh, don't worry, we're your protectors.
Can I just interject a bit on that point? So I guess then, to sort of like summarize your point on that, it's more like the carrot and stick approach that Russia is utilizing when it comes to projecting its power, and how it works around when it comes to developing relations. Because from my thought process, I agree with you on the point that even after the annexation of Crimea really ostracized Russia in the international community. So it needed a way back in to the global, geopolitical game. For me, I saw that with Syria, when it intervened into Syria in 2015, as being one of the, you could say, guarantors for the Assad regime. And I also saw that, as you mentioned, in Afghanistan as well. Because I do tend to agree with you. However, I think that Russia's catching on to that, because even though Putin himself wants to project that the liberal world order has failed, and that the only way to maintain some semblance of power is to engage in the classic realpolitik illiberalism of maintaining some form of status quo, where you mentioned, yes, that they are essentially the alternative to terrorism, essentially. But I think that, especially when it comes to the Middle East, of all the regions, Putin is trying to take over the role of the United States by, for example, mending bilateral relations with Jordan and Israel, because I think that he knows that, yes, you can have that, at least this from my observations, my assessment, is that, yes, you can have the case where, okay, it's either me or the terrorists. However, remember, as what we saw in Chechnya and other such wars, is that those terrorists come back to bite. They come back to roost.
Indeed, they do. And so I should also clarify here as well. When I say that they're going to posture in this way, I don't mean that they're actually intending to do that, of course, because from what I understand from Russia's position in Afghanistan, they don't expect to actually defeat the Taliban ever. So this is one of those things where they're okay with a certain level of terror continuing to exist in that country, which of course is abhorrent morally when you actually when you consider that is their position.
Well, to be totally honest, like, if you understand Russia, and I think we both, I guess, I'm suspecting that most of us do understand the nature of Russia. When you see how it acted, for example, in the Chechen wars, and how Chechnya itself is basically a vassal state for Islamists that somehow maintain some quasi-autonomous status, and semi-autonomous.
It's the same thing they're trying to do again. Exactly. That's the model.
Yeah, there we go. Basically, make another Chechnya.
I do want to give Anthony Roberto some time to chime in here, because he hasn't spoken as much this evening. But Anthony, if you have any other thoughts, feel free to speak before I go to the next statement here. I've got a quote from the father of one of the Marines who was killed in an attack, likely linked to this bounty. But before we go to that, I just want to hear if you've got any other views on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I agree with everyone here. Like, if you look at, like Chechnya, what they brought up, they're not really against terrorism. They're only really against terrorism when it's like against them. It's not like they're actually like, fighting it for like liberal democracy or anything like that. It's only when they're like bombing Moscow is when they really care a little bit about it. When it comes to Chechnya, it's like they stopped the fighting, like, as far as like military fighting goes, but like Chechnya is still a very like radical place, and it's not safe for gay people or for women or for like anybody else who's like a minority. So it's not really better, you know. It's just like they just came to a peace agreement, which I think which is what Putin wants from the Taliban. That's like, okay, like we're just gonna just keep you there so then you guys can do your stuff over there, you know, because obviously, you know, they're not gonna defeat the Taliban. They just don't want the Taliban going against them. You know, like that's the way I see it. And then obviously they're anti-American, so they kind of fused that together, I guess, in a sense. You know, it's kind of like what Russia does in a lot of places. They hook up with people that don't like us.
Yeah. See, that's the thing there, is that you talked about how Putin doesn't really care unless it affects his own country, but even then it's this really kind of superficial approach to combating terrorism. I know I've had many people tell me, you know, in my personal life, you know, in university, etc., that we need to work with Russia because they're also fighting terrorists. Because yes, terrorists have attacked Volgograd, for example, in 2014. They blew up a railway station there, killed a bunch of civilians. They've attacked Moscow subway. There have been other instances of terrorists, including ISIS, you know, basically doing attacks against Russians. But the problem is Putin really doesn't care too much about actually fighting or extinguishing terrorism. He's not going to wage some global war on terrorism. All that he's interested in is having this sort of legitimacy that comes from being attacked in a way. So if ISIS attacks him, it makes him look like, oh, well, we're part of the international community. We're also a victim of ISIS. And it's like, well, yeah, but ISIS is going after literally everybody that's out there. You don't get points. You don't all of a sudden become a liberal Western democracy just because ISIS attacks you, and then you do some raids against ISIS. I know they fired off missiles and they've dropped bombs on ISIS locations and installations in the past, but it's oftentimes overweighted by the fact that they will just bomb civilians on purpose as well.
Yeah. Can I just quickly just clarify on that as well? Since you mentioned that, Russia's approach, especially when it comes to ISIS, is that they will use them as a tool against their opposition, whether it be their whether they be trying to defeat a common enemy that they are allied with. So, for example, when it comes to the Assad regime, Russia will allow, for example, ISIS to run around near Deir ez-Zor or run around near Idlib or one of these areas, basically attacking the opposition. It will stand back, allow them to attack, and when the opposition is very weakened, Russia will come in, not only bombing just ISIS, but also the opposition, because it's using ISIS as a means to an end. That's how Russia approaches it. It uses these enemies, basically, that are traditional enemies that, you know, they're against the principles of even the Russian military and like that. They use these forces as a means to an end because they are true, honest to God, true, real politique state, basically, in terms of its foreign policy.
Right. No,
well, I would just say that I think there's a certain level of irrationality in what they do as well. So I'm just going to read a quote from Peter Zawak, who is apparently a retired U.S. Army Brigadier General who currently serves as a senior Russia-Eurasian Fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies and the National Defense University, and he was previously a senior U.S. defense attaché to the Russian Federation in Moscow. And his quote, the quote that I'm going to give is this. I'm just going to read out his quote, and then you guys can tell me what you think of it. He said, quote, and he was saying this to the website Coffee or Die, who are interviewing him on this, and he said, quote, remembering their own 1989 experience, therefore having a cold-bloodedly pragmatic relationship with the more local Taliban that they see as the primary inheritor of Afghanistan's space, will serve as a sort of firebreak against the spread of transnational jihadist terror into their vulnerable interests in primarily Sunni Central Asia and by extension southern Russia, including the Caucasus. He also then went on and added that Russia's visceral feelings about America's presence in Afghanistan seemingly transcend the fact that our US allied presence and support for the Afghan government helps tamp down precisely that potential future threat. So he seems to be implying there that actually there's a certain level of irrationality in Russia's behavior here, because they could just do nothing and the threat would essentially be dealt with by the United States, who are already present on the ground. Yeah. Why interfere, right? It's because they have some kind of weird thing going on in their head. They're still mad about 1989.
Well, I gather that maybe if I correct myself, when it comes to from my interpretation of their foreign policy, is I do see elements of realpolitik. However, I can see where you're getting at with the irrationality bit, because automatically when you were reading that, I was thinking to myself, Chechnya. I was thinking about the Chechnyan Islamists and that, and how, for example, Russian special forces, when they are, for example, fighting the opposition, for example, in Syria, and they're fighting groups like al-Sham and that, they will find sometimes the bodies of dead Chechen snipers, because as you know, a lot of, for example, ISIS and some of the opposition fighters, especially their best snipers, came from Chechnya and Russia, because as I said before, Chechnya provides probably the best snipers for Islamists, essentially. So I was just thinking to myself, okay, I can gather that, but then Chechnya exists as well. So I'm just a bit, I guess, you can see there's a bit of a contradiction when it comes to, because you mentioned the guy and saying that the fact they're going to protect their, I guess, southern flank, but then what about Chechnya?
Exactly.
You know?
So yeah, there's a certain level of rationality to this. They're not there's calculation that they're engaged in, and then there's also just the visceral emotive stuff that is behind that.
It seems like they try to coerce the opposition a lot. Like when it came to the shoot down of the Su-24 over Turkey, they were able to get friendly with Erdogan pretty fast. It seems like with people who are enemies of Russia, Putin has a way to co-opt them or to work with them. He's got that really weird thing going on with them. It just seems like it pops up a lot in different conflicts around the world.
Well, yeah,
I heard one person refer to it as Putin as irony, bro.
I mean, there is that element of Dugin's Eurasianism and whatnot that comes into it, and that historically speaking, there was this idea that Russia was the third Rome, that Russia was going to take back Constantinople, that Russia, especially under Catherine the Great and a lot of the Tsars that came after her, that they were going to take over the Ottomans and extend the empire all the way down. But then in the post-Soviet era, we have a complete reverse of that, which is there's this ideology that sees Russia and Turkey as like brothers and everything, and that they're united as anti-Western. It used to be that they were divided along Islam versus Orthodox Christianity, with the Russian state claiming to be, the third Rome and everything else. But now they both see themselves as opposed Western liberalism. And so it's no longer Islam versus Orthodox Christianity. Now it's Islam and Orthodox Christianity versus the degenerate West, right? Liberal democracy.
And the way that they've managed to meme themselves into this, I think, I don't know if all of you have ever read this. I know it's weird for me to cite a blog post, right? But 20 Committee, who I'm sure is someone from within the intelligence community in the United States, according to their bio, wrote an article a long time ago called "Putin's Orthodox Jihad." And if you look at it, you immediately come away with an impression based on this person's experience of just how Russian leaders, in the civilian sphere, that is, have this this incredible ideology of anti-liberalism, which is not just along the lines of acting like a mafia leader and trying to accrue as much money as possible, but rather they have extremely socially regressive views and an animus toward the West, which they view as some kind of satanic emanation or whatever. And so I can imagine that if someone were to essentially, put themselves into this mode of thought constantly, they could eventually arrive at the bizarre conclusion that maybe they could just align themselves with Sunni fundamentalists or something, because they pretty much share a lot of values and viewpoints in common.
I actually...
Okay, we'll let Anthony Evistu-Bisson go, but before that, I do just want to say very quickly, there are people in the West, literally, who live amongst us that have bought into this, that see the idea out there that they aestheticize Christianity, especially. Some of them themselves are Christian, and they are envious and in admiration of some of the, especially Sunni, but also, of course, Iran's Shiite state. They see those traditional values there, and they say, I wish that we could have that. Even though they align themselves with Christianity, they are in awe at Islam. So,
Well, the thing is, I want to just mention, just to address also Ray's point on that, because I can definitely see the leap there. Because if you have that mindset that there's degeneracy essentially in the West, and that the West, due to liberalism, is going down the path of destruction, if you have that mindset and you view it as imperative to return to some semblance of order or some form of dignity, because as in Russia itself, there are people, for example, who long for the days of the Soviet Union. Because when you take away, for example, people's sense of identity, whether it be the Soviet Union or even the Tsarist Russia, if you take away the people's sense of identity, then it's not hard for them, for example, to be adrift when it comes to these matters of foreign policy. Now, when it comes to Putin, you've got an ex-KGB officer and a man, for example, who admires Stalin and the Soviet Union, who views the West, for example, as a degenerate slum hole, where it's essentially, with its interests, is trying to undermine whatever remains of Russia's identity. I can actually see a leap between the Salafi jihadists, even whether they exist in Chechnya or not, the Orthodox, you could say Christians, I think it's Orthodox Christians in Moscow and in Russia, and also the more cynical realists as well. I can see this quasi-alliance being made to essentially try to undermine this liberalism and promote the illiberal ideology that they are trying to promote. I think Anthony wants to say something.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, because I know Kraut did a video on this, I think 2 years ago, and for example, Russia had a law against domestic violence, like kind of back in 2008, but it was repealed in 2017, and the law was like somewhat like iffy on like the effectiveness of it, but basically like it at least kind of put like a little bit of a deterrent on domestic violence when it came to like men like beating women or whatever. But the thing is, like, they repealed that, and now that domestic violence has skyrocketed, and they don't have really any way to control it. And even women that go to these police stations, they deny them because again, like they see, like they don't, like they see things like that as just like not a problem in their society. And one of the biggest things that some people note, like some people like Kraut would note, is the fact that like in some ways Russia is just as bad as living in Saudi Arabia. Like that's the thing. Like people will like make Russia out to be like this upstanding country, but in a lot of ways it doesn't have laws or rules to protect people, and it's in a lot of ways it is a lot like these Islamic fundamentalist societies. Like both are anti minorities, both are anti gay, both are anti women, stuff like that. It's like, is there a really huge difference between living in Russia and then like living in like, I don't know, like Turkmenistan or whatever? Like, sure, there might be some minor differences, but they're both extremely illiberal. And I mean, Russia's getting there. It's like it's not too far off from being in that direction. It's just got to push a little bit more further right socially, and the gap isn't really that big. So it's always crazy when people think of Russia as like this great country. It's like, no, it's not. It's not fighting it. It's actually a part of it in a lot of ways when it comes to Islamic fundamentalism. And I was just using that as the example as being super socially conservative. So yeah,
for sure. And as you point out, I mean, there is something to note here, though, and I think this is controversial. A lot of people have a big problem when I bring this up. They really don't like this sort of rhetoric. They see it as essentially, oh, neocons equal bootlickers for Saudi confirmed. But when we're comparing Russia and Saudi Arabia specifically, just those two, Saudi Arabia is reforming in a liberal direction. Granted, very small, and it might take 100 years at this rate. Whereas Russia is going backwards. So you could say Russia might be in some ways slightly more liberal now, but Russia is moving in a very anti-liberal direction. Whereas under MBS, Saudi Arabia has at least put in some reforms and has cooperated with the West in many ways. And after Iran is dealt with, the West can apply more pressure on Saudi Arabia to reform, going back to like the Jean Kirkpatrick model with that you essentially work with illiberal systems against a greater evil so that you can win, as well as having leverage over those illiberal systems in the wake of the defeat of the greater evil to pressure them to reform. And so my view is that in 50 years, if things were to keep up at this rate and nothing else were to happen in the world, and we just saw Saudi Arabia and Russia go their ways, Saudi Arabia would look a lot more like a more conservative version of maybe Poland or something, but much more liberal than it is today. And Russia would look a lot more like North Korea in 50 years. And so Saudi Arabia would obviously be the far better country to live in at that point, even though it's still probably a conservative country. They'll have a lot more freedoms than they do now. Russia will have less freedoms than they do now. So just their trajectory, one's moving backwards, one's moving forwards. Now, of course, as I said, the caveat to that is that it's a very slow movement forwards in the case of Saudi Arabia. In Russia's case, it's kind of a fast movement backwards. But I do want to go to a quote here, and we will wrap up the stream in about the next 15 minutes or so, because I do want to keep these, relatively short because I'm trying to stream every day. But there is a quote here from the father of Corporal Robert Hendricks, who's 25, who was killed in an attack in Afghanistan in April of 2019, which was believed to be essentially sponsored by the bounties that were placed on U.S. soldiers. That this was something that the Taliban that conducted this, they were rewarded for by the Russians. This is what is believed at this point by the intelligence community. Hendricks' father told the Associated Press, he said that even a rumor of Russian bounty should have been immediately addressed. And then he went on to say, and I quote, "If this was kind of swept under the carpet as to not make it a bigger issue with Russia, and 1 ounce of blood was spilled when they knew this, I lost all respect for this administration and everything." End quote. So that's by Eric Hendricks, the father of Robert Hendricks there. So I want to go to everybody's thoughts on this right here, because that's a U.S., that's the father of a U.S. Marine who was killed, and very likely was killed as a result of there was a bounty on his head. So these are real people, right? Donald Trump did nothing about it. And yet we're going to have people who say, oh, yeah, but Joe Biden, he won't care about the military. He's going to, defund the Pentagon. He's going to defund the police. He's going to what? I mean, there's a lot of this rhetoric that comes out there that says, well, if you care about the military, you have to support Trump. So.
Well, I mean, in terms of the way this bounty thing was operating, today there was an exclusive that came out, and I'm sure it's either the New York Times or the Washington Post. I cannot remember which one of these it is, but dollar transfers were actually intercepted in terms of data, were actually intercepted by intelligence already, and this was also shown to Donald Trump apparently. Testimonies from Taliban prisoners that were captured in Afghanistan, they also apparently knew about it. And additionally, on top of that, we have knowledge of one intermediary who was instrumental in getting the transfers of the bounty to the people who Russia was rewarding. And that intermediary is now hiding literally inside Russia, with the knowledge of the Russians, of course.
Oh,
so,
wow.
I mean, the fact that we've reached this point now, I mean, how is his presidency even continuing to roll on day after day as this conversation is happening, right? I mean, imagine if this were literally any other presidency. Imagine if you literally had the president piling around with terrorists, because that was what he was doing. I mean, during this year in which he's known about this issue and has known the details about how it was occurring, he has literally invited the Taliban to Camp David, extended the invitation to have Russia being brought back into the G7 because he wanted to expand it to G11 so that it would include Russia, because obviously Russia's economy has fallen to the extent that they're no longer the 8th largest economy in the world. They're now the 11th largest economy in the world. So you had to literally expand it to encompass them.
That's so good. That's so good, because they wouldn't be the G8. That's the thing. People think it would be the G8 if you brought them back. No, they're
it would have to be the G11.
They're smaller than Illinois. They're smaller than Illinois. economic.
And so, I mean, this is the ridiculousness that has been going on. And so they need to answer for that. The other thing that I just wanted to get in there on as well, when I said earlier that there was an article published in 2014 by the 20 Committee about, Putin's, quote, orthodox jihad. I just want to read 2 paragraphs from that, which I think will really show that this is something that everyone had overlooked. Right? Because if you're approaching politics from a secular perspective, then sometimes you may fail to notice when there is strange religious extremism going on in your midst, because it doesn't always show itself openly. So I'm just going to quickly just do a quick quote here. So I'm quoting from 20 Committee's article, and they say the following. Quote, early in Putin's years in the Kremlin, the younger generation of federal security officers embraced the nascent ideology termed the system, also obviously called Sistema, which was a sort of elitist Czechism, toughness free of corruption and based in patriotism, updated for the new 21st century. However, this would have limited appeal to the masses, so in its place was gradually taken by a doctrine called spiritual security, quote unquote. You're going to hear this a lot. This involved the ideological fusion of the FSB, and the Russian Orthodox Church, culminating in the 2002 dedication of an Orthodox church at the Lubyanka, the FSB and former KGB's notorious Moscow headquarters. It suddenly became fashionable for senior FSB officers to have conversion experiences, while spiritual security offered Putin's Russia a way to defend itself against what it has long seen as the encroachment of, quote, decadent postmodern Western values, end quote. Just how seriously Putin took all this was his statement that Russia's spiritual shield was as important to her security as her nuclear shield. Nearly all Western experts, being mostly secularists when not atheists, paid no attention to these clear indicators of where Putin was taking Russia, while the view of the few who did notice was colored by the perception that this simply had to be a put-up job by the Kremlin. But what if it is not? Skeptics are correct to note that Czechists have a toxic and convoluted relationship with the ROC ever since Stalin, that failed Orthodox seminarian resurrected the remnants of the church, what little had survived vicious Bolshevik persecution, during the darkest days of the Great Patriotic War to buttress the regime with faith and patriotism, all tightly controlled by the secret police. There was the rub. Under the Soviets, all senior ROC appointments were subject to Czechist review, while nobody became a bishop without the KGB having some compromat on him. This was understood by all, including the fact that a distressing number of ROC senior clerics were actual KGB agents. It's not surprising that Putin omits from his CV that he worked for a time in the KGB's 5th Directorate, which supervised religious bodies, leading some to speculate that Putin's relationship with certain ROC bishops extends deep into the late Soviet period. The ROC is not Russia's state religion, as Putin and top bishops have been at pains to state, but it cannot be denied that the Moscow Patriarchate's close ties to the Kremlin granted a very special relationship with Putinism. Whether this actually is symphonia, meaning the Byzantine-style unity of state and church, which is something of an Orthodox ideal, in stark contrast to American notions of separation of church and state, remains to be seen. But Orthodoxy has become the close political and ideological partner of the Kremlin in recent years, a preferred vehicle for explicit anti-Western propaganda. And then, of course, the article goes on to explain the ways in which they see the West as somehow in decline, purely on its moral values or whatever. And it's basically just lots of them complaining about women and not liking gay people, right?
Well,
so,
can I just...
yes, go on.
Sorry to interject here, but what you mentioned there about Czechism and the relationship between the religious elements within the Russian government and the security apparatus, it does make sense, because I still remember reading articles from, probably I didn't read these articles at the time in 2008, I read them more in 2013, by Chris Hitchens, where he talked about essentially the weird relationship between the Russian Orthodox Church and Putin. And that what you say over there actually does make sense, because I do agree with you. There's a problem with a lot of liberal-minded people and even secular-minded people, and sometimes I may fall into this at times, but there's this assumption that all state actors or all, I guess, officials within the government capacity or in the security apparatus of a state must somehow be rational, when in reality we forget the effects of ideology in forming essentially narratives and informing our perceptions of the world. So what you mentioned there with Putin, it makes sense when you put it into that wider framework of the ideology that he's purporting when it comes
Yeah.
to his liberal
This is the same mistake that was
Yeah.
made with Iran as well.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree. As for your, by the way, as for the quote that Kevin read from that soldier, it is actually quite sad to hear that, because it does show you that it just goes back to my original point. It goes back to the fact that there's a failure of leadership in the United States. At the end of the day, the United States needs its leadership back. Whether it comes with Biden or whether it comes with someone else in 2024, there needs to be a return to some form of normalcy and leadership. Because at the moment, you can see that America is dying for that at the moment. It's dying to be led by proper, competent leaders again. And I think that it sort of has a ripple effect across the rest of the world.
And also the security of like just of everyday people in Central Asia as well. Because I mean, the thing that's been omitted, well, not really omitted, but not talked about as much in this whole controversy that's going on right now is, Afghan civilians have been dying because of the fact that Russia believes it's okay to balance terror against terror. I mean, this is ridiculous. It's basically Russia has no respect. And I've been saying this for a long time, but basically Russia has no respect for anyone in Central Asia. They have, frankly, a structurally racist approach to these regions. They think, okay, well, you're not worth much, so they're just gonna treat people like they're entirely disposable. They have no respect for these population groups whatsoever, and it's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, they see themselves as only being in this superpower competition with the United States, with no responsibility to any of the people adjacent to them, no responsibility, perhaps even to their own citizens. I mean, this is ridiculous, and it's not even like. The other thing about them is that they don't collaborate with others, because part of the motivation, which people often don't emphasize, is that Russia also has this bizarre fear of China that they have going on as well, where they're afraid that if they don't do these things in Central Asia, that someday China will just buy its way into the territory through the trade of goods, and then Russia will be locked out of Central Asia entirely. And I'm thinking to myself, well, which one would we rather prefer? The idea that China's going to enter the location with the manufacturer of goods, or that Russia's going to balance terror with terror. I mean, this is a ridiculous what's the word for it? Well, you see people talking about this Russian sphere of influence or whatever. So we're supposed to believe now that basically there is a three-way power contest in which there's the United States, China, and Russia in Central Asia, and somehow you've got all these edgelords on social media in the West preferring Russia out of the three because they think that China is de facto bad. The United States is also somehow de facto bad. And so then they arrive at the position that they should allow Russia to balance terror with terror. This is a ridiculous position.
Yeah, Ray, I just want to say quickly that their point there is that China is like this new menace that's coming up and everything, and that they're the real enemy. Russia's the savior of the West. And the West is a degenerate state that funds terrorists, and so Putin's the one fighting the terrorists. That's their rhetoric. That's what the alt-right talks about.
Can I just quickly interject before we go to Anthony Roberto, because I can see he's in the corner just quietly waiting for his turn. So I just quickly will make it a bit quick on this, but because it's China and Russia want to provide their sort of alternative autocratic models, and what I kind of have. I've always thought that even with this great power competition, I would really like to see, for example, the rise of smaller states and non-state actors as well. Not, of course, the jihadists and that, just more state actors, whether it be in Central Asia themselves, where they can actually, instead of having to depend either on the United States or Russia or China, they themselves have the power to step up and actually decide their own fate. And, of course, not the fate of the jihadist ones.
Exactly. And, one of the prerequisites to that is you have to develop the trade links, you have to develop the economies in those locations, so they'll have something to actually build up an economic influence with. And this is something which I think the supporters of Trump didn't understand, because and the same thing you see happening with Boris Johnson and his supporters in the United Kingdom as well, where they'll come in and the first thing they'll immediately do is start cutting foreign aid. Or they'll start advocating against doing trade deals, et cetera, or they'll have these disparaging views of these developing countries, and they won't want to interact with them. This is, of course, ridiculous, because by refusing to interact with these countries and refusing to help build them up, it just leaves the gate open for someone like Russia to come in and essentially muscle their way around.
Yeah.
I think
I want to let Anthony Roberto
Yeah.
into the discussion again, though. So, Anthony,
Yeah, I wanted to say, when it comes to China, as far as Afghanistan goes, I think from what I've read, they have some troops that are training on the Wakhan corridor. So there's like a small corridor between Afghanistan and China that link, and apparently they're training soldiers there. So China does seem like, in a sense, they would get involved in Afghanistan, and they are getting involved in broader Central Asia. They have a lot of there's kind of a cold war between China and Russia and Kazakhstan. They're trying to
Yes.
fight out the balance there because the PM of Kazakhstan is like, do I go this way? Do I go that way? What way do I go? Because they're running in circles because one's gonna one's gonna do something to them. But anyways, and this is why I'm really big on foreign aid, free trade, and I'm big on making sure that, well, hopefully that U.S. companies can come in. They can be the ones that buy out the contracts. For example, I think it was in Tajikistan, or maybe it was in another country, where they have like this railroad, but Chinese state-owned companies bought out that contract to build their public transportation. We should be the ones that are buying out these contracts. If the U.S. or anyone wants to be a part of, like, I guess, like, try to influence the liberal world order, like a lot of, I think, especially when it comes to the U.S., like, we really got to step our foot up and stop being so isolationist with trade and diplomacy, because it really hurts us in a lot of ways. And what I think when it comes to Central Asia, it's like we don't have much of influence there, like, to begin with. Like, I know we have like embassies in all the countries and whatnot, though, but we really don't have much, though. Like, every once in a while we have like a ambassador say something, or maybe we send like an envoy or whatever. But it's like we're not helping problems such as like the Aral Sea crisis, or the Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan problem. They have ethnic clashes there and stuff like that. It's like we're not being the ones that are negotiating this stuff. We're not even active, like, on a diplomatic level as much in Central Asia as I want to be. And there's all these things that go on in that region that we should be involved, because we should be that, like, hey, you don't have to choose between China or Russia. We can be there. We can be the ones that can help settle these disputes. And the thing is, when it comes to Trump, is that it's like, especially with his administration, it's more like, just fuck it. Let's just not do anything. Or I guess in this case of Afghanistan, let's just leave. And I think when it comes to that, it's like a lot of these countries are going to have the choice between either Russia or China, because we're not really involved, and I don't think we'll be involved for some time, or who knows when. So in this case, I think a lot of these Central Asian countries are going to pull more towards China, because China's offering the one belt, one road initiative.
Indeed.
So yeah,
and also
so
the imbalanced position of the West on this issue as well is that the West quite correctly imposed sanctions on Russia after what happened in Ukraine. Except this created an interesting dynamic in which Russia can no longer rely on the West for economic investment and so on, because the sanctions exist, thus pinning them between the European Union and China. And then, of course, obviously China becomes their sort of economic supporter of last resort. This places them in a subordinate position to China, which means that China will win across Central Asia if the economic game plays out to its completion. So there is that. But the West should have then obviously understood this ahead of time and made sure that whatever China's victories are in Central Asia, which will mostly be at the cost of Russia, that they would be present on the scene as well, so that China's victory would not be like literally 100% complete. But for some reason, they did. I don't think the Trump administration ever joined that concept up in their own head. But I think the reason for that, maybe because individuals within the administration, including Donald Trump themselves, were so sympathetic to Russia that they stopped thinking about what their own country was supposed to do.
Right.
So they've spent their entire time essentially trying to help Russia against China, instead of actually thinking, wait, but we have a country. It's actually called the United States. What if we help the United States against, like, maybe both? What if that was a thing, right? So it's very bizarre behavior that we've essentially seen coming from the U.S. administration. They seem to be more concerned with the fact that Russia is losing to China in Central Asia than they are in actually doing something in Central Asia.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's no plan or doctrine. I mean, it's just the usual, you know. It's not we treat it as like we're going to Iceland and sending someone over there to talk. Like that's all it
Yeah.
is. I mean, it's
Well,
just it's pretty pathetic.
I would just like to interject before Kevin, I suspect, jumps in as well. I want to say that the United States should have some alternative model like Marshall Plan again, something like an alternative economic model to China's One Belt, One Road initiative, because at least that way you can get a lot of states around the world on the side of the United States. Because at the moment, China is winning on this front, and it seems to especially be influencing in the EU, and also Russia, for that matter, is also influencing countries like Germany, because they set up that what is that, gas pipeline, or what was it again? I can't remember what it's called, but I think Anthony would know this. Do you remember that? What's the deal that they set up between Germany and Russia?
The one with Merkel. That was
Yeah, the one
Nord Stream.
Yeah, the Nord Stream. There we go.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Nord
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Stream.
yeah.
I was
Yeah, well,
thinking
yeah, yeah.
Gulf Stream,
That
but
that one
Nord
actually
Stream, yeah.
that goes through Belarus, right? That's a complete landlocked pipeline, I think. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but I think I'll give it over to Kevin now.
Yeah, well, I haven't spoken too much tonight, but of course, you know, I like hosting these panels because we bring on guests with, you know, a lot of expertise and knowledge in these areas and whatnot. And I mean, everybody in the audience already knows how I feel about Russia and whatnot, but we will be wrapping up this stream very shortly. I'll give all the guests the opportunity to make their closing remarks before we close out. However, I do just want to note here that when we're talking about the Taliban, for example, we're talking about terrorism in general. There is always this idea that is purported by our opponents, that is essentially promulgated by very illiberal people that will argue that you can choose between peace and war, and that us here with the Hawks, we want war, and they want peace. But the problem is, as long as the Taliban is the one that we're going to throw Afghanistan to the wolves, essentially, and that they're the ones that are going to take over, there can be no peace. Because just as they gave safe harbor, and just as they gave aid and a training ground and all kinds of support to Al Qaeda to attack the United States, so too will they again offer their country, if we give it back to them, as another base from which either they themselves or an affiliated terrorist group in the future can conduct further operations against U.S. interests and Western interests, such as including literally blowing up buildings in Western skylines. So there can be no peace as long as the world is divided between the free and the enslaved. And so the idea out there that the Hawks like war, that we're going to start World War III, this sort of thing, that you don't understand, man. The Russians, what, you're talking about getting tough on them, that would start World War III. Well, I have news here. World War III will eventually happen. Now, World War III with Russia, that would be bad, I think, and I've talked about this before, that there are ways to economically cripple them to the point that they are removed as a rival. However, with the trajectory that we're going on right now of isolationism, of disconcern with world affairs, of essentially the administration in the United States having a policy of sticking its head in the sand and pretending that the rest of the world doesn't exist, that will not yield peace. Neville Chamberlain tried that. Donald Trump has spoken favorably about Neville Chamberlain in the past, which is beyond repugnant. Neville Chamberlain was the one who went from having a war that would have killed potentially, a few million people, to having a war that killed over 50 million people in Europe because he chose peace. Peace against terrorists, peace with respect to Putin, with respect to Xi, with respect to the Taliban, is no peace worth having. That doesn't mean that you have to just start bombing Putin and Xi. As I've talked about, there are economic means to remove them. But there are no economic means to get rid of the Taliban. The Taliban has to be bombed into non-existence. That's my attitude with respect to this. And the idea that, oh, we've been there too long or whatnot. Well, that attitude was something that was prevalent in Canada, and Canada withdrew from Afghanistan. That was a travesty. If America does the same, that's going to be a bigger problem, because America is one of the last countries that has a presence in Afghanistan in terms of supporting the civilian government there. We've had over 50,000 casualties by Afghan security forces and associated personnel that are trying to maintain law and order in the region and trying to give the Afghan people a fighting chance at democracy going into the future. This idea, oh, but it's been, 19 years? Yeah, and they've gone from controlling the vast majority of the country to controlling about 13% or less. That's good. That's a good trajectory. If you stay another 20 years, it's very well possible that they will be wiped out. But if you give up now, it's very, very almost much assured that they will go back to having their previous status quo. And all the blood spilled, all the lives lost, all the sacrifice, all the money, again, even if you only cared about the money, all of that will be for naught. And that is unacceptable. And so that's my position on this. But with all that being said, I'm not going to have any sort of closing remarks after. I'll just close out with my, standard sort of sales pitch or whatnot when it comes to, liking the video and stuff. But so with that, we will go to the closing remarks from Anthony, Ray, and then Anthony Roberto. So we'll start with Anthony Vistubison. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me on as usual, Kevin. Yes, the matter of Trump essentially not doing anything about the fact that Russia is essentially getting bounties on US soldiers through the Taliban and paying the Taliban to essentially kill US personnel is shocking, but yet not surprising given the lack of leadership that the Trump administration is demonstrating to the world. I honestly do believe that the United States needs a return to leadership. It needs a return to an assertiveness where it's actually an active participant in the world rather than a passive or reactive participant in the world. Because at the moment, China and Russia are all clutching at their own individual sects of spheres of influence around the world, and they are essentially promoting their illiberal world order in the face of a sort of a declining United States world leadership. And I think that's a very troubling development. And if the United States is declining, and if the United States is essentially going to give up its position, then I hope at least, and I also want, and this must happen, that states who are at least liberal in nature or align liberally need to stand up together and come together in a concerted effort to challenge the liberalism promoted by China and Russia. Because if we don't, it could mean the end of our way of existence. Because at the end of the day, I just want to say that I'm not, I guess, at the end of the day, for World War III. I'm not for war in general. What I have always said to myself is that if negotiations fail, when all those means of diplomacy fail, and if push comes to shove and war has to be the option, then I guess war will be the option. However, the whole aim of it is to avoid that possibility. The whole aim is to make sure that you go through every single other means to avoid war. Not, may I say, that does not mean, as isolationists would like to say, that we should appease our enemies. That's not the idea. You essentially are utilizing all your avenues for diplomacy and negotiations with these regimes. And if that cannot work, and if the moment demands it, then you need to stand up to these regimes and be tough. But at the end of the day, it's not as simple as going to war or not going to war. It's all about the more complexities and the nuances that are involved in this. And I honestly think that we need to have an empowerment of previously disenfranchised peoples around the world, not of course jihadists, or not those that want to violate the rights and freedoms and individuality and autonomy of other people. So that has always been my position, is that we need to empower those who believe in our ideals of democracy, justice, human rights, and who want to at least exist as they are whether they be non-state actors or state actors. I believe that we need to champion them and support them against illiberal state actors, and we have to stand strong together to oppose the growing menace of illiberalism that is coming from or emanating from Russia and China. And with that, I say thank you Kevin for having me. And you can follow me at Stoic Viper or look at my website, philosophyismagic.com.
Yeah, no, thank you for coming on, Anthony. Definitely appreciate your perspective here. And with that, we're going to go to Ray Murasame for your closing remarks. Thanks for coming on, Ray.
Yeah, no problem at all. So what I'll say is, in response to your previous comment, Kevin, where you were saying that obviously peace is impossible with the Taliban. I'm just going to add for my closing statement, I'm just going to add a clear illustration of this, because you can't make peace with people who have no intention of upholding peace or enacting or creating a society that people can flourish in, because their entire society is basically just unending war. So I'll explain so that people can hear what I have to say on this, and then if they don't like it, then they're free to challenge me to a debate or something if they think I'm wrong. But appeasing the Taliban was actually tried before in the 1990s. So the idea there was that the United States at the time, perhaps slightly naive to the true nature of these people, was that they wanted to create something called the Afghan-Uzbek pipeline, which was being sponsored by American, Saudi, and Russian oil giants, because obviously, if you're present, you're present. And during this time, Mullah Omar was actually interviewed by a Pakistani journalist called Mohammed Mir. And Mohammed Mir went to the Taliban, Mullah Omar specifically, and sat down for this interview and explained to him the situation which he himself was in. And Mullah Omar was not even familiar with this story. So Mohammed Mir asked him, do you self-perceive as being sort of like a satrap or a dog, quote, a dog of the Americans, because of the fact that your movement appears to be exclusively devoted to helping them on the issue of this pipeline? So Mullah Omar was perplexed and responded to him by saying, well, this is a ridiculous accusation which you brought to me, and that, quote, I will show you I'm not a dog of the Americans. I will invite someone here that you did not expect. And so Mohammed Mir then says, oh, who are you inviting here? And then he responded, Osama bin Laden. So, that's the first thing. The United States did not initiate this problem with the Taliban. They did not initiate it. If the United States essentially did not touch them before they were touched by them. Okay, so later in that same in that same cycle, after Osama bin Laden had been invited to Afghanistan, he actually went there and began organizing with Al Qaeda, and you all know how that played out in 2001. So that happened right under the nose of the Taliban, who assisted in that entire planning process. The United States did not initiate that. That was not a reaction to something the United States did. They got up and decided to do that because their ideological position is that they just don't like people who are secular. It's as simple as that. It sounds overly simplistic, but it really is as simple as that. The other thing about this, which implicates Pakistan to some extent, is that later on, of course, as you all might know, around 1997, the government of Benazir Bhutto was subjected to an attempted coup attempt in Pakistan by certain ISI officers who had become converted to Islamist ideology during the administration of Mohammad Zia-ul-Haq, who had supported Nawaz Sharif, who himself later became prime minister of Pakistan in 1997. So you ended up with what I would call this kind of like weird reverse osmosis thing, because the ISI, after Mohammad Zia-ul-Haq's Islamization process took effect, was that they were using radical Islamist groups as a way to get strategic depth inside of Afghanistan to fulfill their strategic objectives. However, much like the story of what we described in Russia earlier on, in terms of people interacting with religious organizations but then becoming, weirdly embedded and converted to those things, the same thing seems to have happened in the context of Pakistan, where the ISI officers who were engaged in establishing that strategic depth also came to start to believe in the ideology of the thing that they were weaponizing in the first place, and this then vectored its way back up through the ranks of soldiers in Pakistan until it led to this coup attempt occurring. So, with that going on, you have a real problem of just how naive are commentators if they think that they can make a peace deal with something that is that virulent and has been in the region for that long, and additionally something which reaches out to go out of its way to attack secular groups, to attack liberal groups, to attack feminist groups, and so on, regardless of whether they're touched, left alone in their own space, disregarded, ignored, etc. Ignoring them only makes them bolder, because then they feel as though they're not being watched and that they can do whatever they want. And so, yeah, that's pretty much my closing statement. And if anyone in the audience or anyone who is listening thinks that I'm wrong about this and that there's some alternate story that we are unaware of, or that, we're all weird neocons or something like this, then I don't know what to tell them other than maybe they should challenge us here to a debate, and we will debate them and win against them. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I'm the only neocon on the panel tonight, but that tends to be the actual case. And there's this idea out there that it's the neocon ghouls who do everything bad.
It's absolutely ridiculous. This is one of those things where the neocons would be absolutely correct to point out that they didn't actually have to do anything for Islamic fundamentalists to hit at them. This is common sense. It's just that somehow people started to turn this word neocon into some kind of ultimate last boss monster or something without actually thinking about what it actually means.
No, that's correct. I mean, the neoconservative camp in general has lived rent-free in the heads of all of our opponents more than any other group since 2003 at a minimum. But arguably, you could go back to even the end of the Cold War. It's just it's a profound triggering of the paleocons, the libertarians, the aggressive left, the isolationists, the Noam Chomskyites, etc. All of them. Their number one most evil sort of final boss, right? That they have to confront is the neocons. They still think that it's, March, April 2003 right now, and there are neocons that have real power in Washington, D.C. Point to the neocons. They'll say, oh, well, sure, Trump is fighting them, but it's the deep state and the mainstream media. And I look at the mainstream media, and I know we're running low on time right now, but I look at the mainstream media. Show me a neocon. Just show me a hawk in the mainstream media right now. Somebody the other day asked me, they're like, are you a fan of Rachel Maddow? Or are you a fan of Hannity? Like, do you watch Rachel Maddow or Hannity, basically? And I'm like, I looked at them, I said to them, it was on Twitter, and I'm just like, I find Rachel Maddow to have some good reporting on Trump with respect to Russia. I've watched some of her stuff for a few years now. However, to me, it's so superficial because I know for a fact that if Mitt Romney had won in 2012, she would have been doing all these segments about how Mitt Romney was dangerous and about to start World War III with Russia. So it's all partisan hackery. And then as far as Hannity goes, Hannity again is superficial. He'll have, some hawkish sort of points if it's somebody like McCain running against Obama or defending Mitt Romney. But then now that it's Trump, he's an isolationist. So they're both.
Yeah, they don't seem to have solid. They don't seem to have solid views. They're just essentially for whatever the Republican front runner is for. I often get the impression that people like Sean Hannity haven't even thought through any of the reasons as to why they believe the things that they believe. And I'm saying this is not exclusive to them, because obviously there are plenty of people also on the center left and the far left who also act the same way as well, where it's just some kind of knee-jerk response to, okay, so what is it? What is it that our opponents are saying? Okay, can we take the opposite of that position?
That's basically it. And we've seen that exposed with Trump, because Trump, as we all know, and we've called him out on this program many times before, he will flip-flop. He'll change his policy over time, sometimes within the span of a few months, sometimes within the span of a few days. He'll change his line. And you'll see the Democrats attack him, say, from, I don't know, let's just say the stereotypical left when Trump makes a right-wing argument. But then Trump changes his mind, gives a left-wing argument, and then the Democrats attack him now from the right on that. And it's so see-through. It's so transparent. So to answer that question, I'm not a fan of Rachel Maddow, and I'm not a fan of Sean Hannity. Rachel Maddow, she'll have more sources than Hannity, but Hannity doesn't purport to be a journalist or anything. He says straight up he's just a conservative commentator. So that's Hannity's program. He does what he wants, and he has an audience there. I see them in many ways as two sides of the same partisan sort of coin. So show me somebody in the mainstream media who's a liberal hawk, who's a neocon, who's an interventionist. You just don't see that in mainstream media anymore, unless sometimes John Bolton will have a book out, or David Frum will have a book out, so he'll get interviewed, or Bill Kristol will be interviewed. But show me like the people that are actually anchors, the people that get the full-time positions and stuff that are hawkish.
And they
There
often-
are not. So
Also, often these pundits make the clear mistake of viewing every single country outside of the United States or outside of Western Europe or outside of developed countries as being run by somehow, entirely ordered and well-meaning individuals at every layer of their governments. So, for example, I mean, many of the things I've said here just now would probably lead to people arguing back, vociferously that, oh, how dare I say these things about the Afghan and Pakistan leadership? I mean, this is ridiculous, right? Because I think everyone knows at this point that this is what these people have done because it's literally there in the history. But instead, we get these weird, stilted stories about how everything was perfect and idyllic. And then the neocons, right? It's absolutely ridiculous. Pakistan and Afghanistan were broken on a complete system level, were broken long before the United States showed up in 2001. The whole fact of the matter that the situation played out the way it did on September the 11th, 2001, was a symptom of the level of brokenness that was going on in the region. So the idea that somehow, Donald Trump can just withdraw all of the troops from Afghanistan and somehow it become a weird Russian sphere of influence in the middle of Central Asia, with Pakistan simultaneously supporting strategic depth of various terror groups, and then everything's somehow going to work its way out, even though that didn't work out last time. I don't understand why they think that doing the exact same thing that happened the first time is going to lead to a different result.
yeah, that's insanity, right? Do the same thing over and over again, and
Exactly.
to
Do the same thing over and over again, and then somehow each time not expect that a 9/11 style event is going to be the outcome.
Oh, well,
Why?
we couldn't have seen it coming. We couldn't have seen it coming. We tried to make peace. It's not like Neville Chamberlain tried the same thing. It's not like that same sort of position wasn't tried with respect to Saddam Hussein. It's
Exactly.
it
Like,
goes
how
on
many
and on
times
and
do they
on.
want to repeat it? And it's not even like these are like analogous things or something. I mean, it's literally the same group of people. They haven't even apologized. They haven't even made a modicum of an apology for the thing that they deliberately did.
Oh,
And
yeah.
then Trump actually tried to invite these individuals to Camp David.
Well, that's
what was it? On the
left.
days before September 11th. So basically,
That's
the
right.
Taliban would have been inside the United States at Camp David on September 11th anniversary.
Yeah, right near New York, right? I mean, it's just that it was pathetic. John Bolton left. Like, this is another thing. I'm so sick of people saying that, oh, John Bolton, he has no principles. I see it every time John Bolton links to like one of his interviews. The comments are flooded with people saying like, coward, you sold out, all this kind of stuff and everything. And I'm like, he gave up a very prestigious job
To go in there and see what was going on. I mean, without his presence there, we might not have a gigantic book which details all of the madness that went on. So perhaps he joined the administration strategically precisely in order to see what was going on.
But Ray, you're missing the point, though. He's going to make some money from the book, so therefore we can discard it all, because it's not like Bernie wrote a book. It's not like Obama wrote a book. Like, all these people write books.
No one is allowed
It's
to
not
write
an
books
argument.
anymore.
They all write books and they all make money from it. It's just, I hear what you're saying, Mr. Bolton, but you're going to make $2 million from the book. So it's like, okay, but like Bernie also became a millionaire from the book. Like, this is a bit of an aside. I always like to point out, I find it funny how prior to Bernie becoming a millionaire, he used to give speeches that say things like, the problem with the country is the millionaires and the billionaires. And then after he writes the book and after he becomes, decades in the Senate, all this kind of stuff, after he accrues some wealth, he breaches the 7-figure net worth level. Now, if you hear his tune, he always says, the problem with this country is the billionaires. It's the billionaires. No mention of the millionaires. Now he's part of the millionaires.
Yeah, suddenly no mention of millionaires. What are we talking about? Exactly. Because it's just like, it's like there's a level of self-consciousness there where he realizes, okay, I'm now part of this millionaire group. So
millionaires are working people too. Millionaires are working people too.
Workers too. It's one of those very sort of like things where you play into populism and then you realize that you've actually caught yourself out.
No, it's so great. It's so great. It's so all these people that are going after Bolton right now and saying about, oh, you're going to make the book and all this sort of stuff. It's like, okay, I'm so done with it. And so I feel like I'm one of the only people on Twitter and all these comment segments all these like hundreds of replies that are all just anti-Bolton. I feel like I'm the only one defending him. And 80% of the time that I see the profile of somebody who's criticizing Bolton and saying, traitor or coward or whatever, they're like a conservative Christian Republican. And they're done with Bolton. And they're like, calling him, all these names and stuff. And then the other 20% are like your Noam Chomsky-ite, Jimmy Dore fans and stuff who they hate Bolton because he's on the left, or they're on the left, and they see him as like this warmonger and everything. But now all these right-wing guys, they see him as like this warmonger and everything. It's a mess. It's a mess. There are some pro-Bolton people on Twitter, but Twitter, the good thing about Twitter, I'll say this, the only good thing about Twitter is that it's not representative of reality. Most people in the real world don't have a Twitter account and they're normal, and they would see the radicalization on Twitter and say, oh, wow, who let all the crazy
what the hell is going on, right?
Like as you would think, if you saw Twitter, you would think that most of the people out there are either a Nazi or a communist. Pretty
much.
But we're going to go to Anthony Roberto, though, for your closing remarks. Obviously, the stream has gone a bit longer than I had hoped, but we always talk about some interesting stuff. So, thanks for coming on, Anthony.
Yeah, I mean, I think to what Ray said earlier, yeah, like Pakistan bad. Pakistan PM said Osama was a martyr, so Pakistan bad. Russia is bad.
Yep.
And I think one thing that Bush said back in 2001 is we don't negotiate with terrorists. We shouldn't. And as far as Russia and China goes, we should do peace through strength. And as always, thank you for having me on.
Oh, yeah. No, thanks, Anthony. But definitely, I try to do these streams every day. Been pretty consistent, especially the last month with that. So you guys are always welcome on. So I'm not sure what I'll be talking about tomorrow, but sometimes stuff like this comes up where today I checked my Twitter account when I got up and saw that Ray had tweeted at me saying, this is worse than we thought. It turned out he knew about it about a year before the time that we were reporting on it earlier on. We were covering this when it was a few months delay that he hadn't done anything. And now it turns out it's closer to a year and a half. How pathetic is that? That's a disgrace. But I've already spoken my my perspective on this. The guests, of course, here tonight have brought great commentary to the stream, and we appreciate it. So with that, we're going to wrap things up. Be sure to like this video. Be sure to subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so yet. Go and check out all of the guests on Twitter. Again, you can subscribe, or rather follow Anthony V. Stubison on Twitter at Stoic Viper. You can follow Ray Mursame on Twitter at Ray Mursame, and you can follow Anthony Roberto on Twitter at Global Affairs. You can also follow me on Twitter at Kevin Castley. So we are also airing live right now to Twitch, and if you haven't done so yet, be sure to go and like this video over on, or rather, be sure to follow my channel over on Twitch and like this video on YouTube. And then finally, if you'd like to directly contribute to the financial viability of this channel, you can support me directly on Patreon at patreon.com/superpowerbroadcasting. And it's the patrons that make the daily content like this possible. And once we hit $100 a month, we will have daily videos pre-recorded that will premiere to YouTube, in addition to the streams airing live to Twitch and YouTube. And so thank you for being here, everybody, and have a good night.